Good day, everyone. However, myself not cool, concerning this beast, this is a donkey. However, as it is shown there, this certain donkey is maimed, there is cruelty, of treatment of these animals, is the owners, they're being neglected. Some of them, as you can see here, they are eating, grass, and there is, also, plastics and stuff, they can easily swallow such, and they can succumb, to death, as people, negligently, throw, such, these places, and also, as you all know it, this is a majestic, animal, as you all know it, during the times, of Jesus, Jesus, made a mighty entrance, into, the city of Jerusalem, with a donkey, to be seen riding in donkey. It was, in something that was, this was a royalty, However, these donkeys, as you know it, they've been servicing our communities for, centuries and centuries. However, they're being treated, negligently. How I wish, more of the SPCA, hospitals can be built, for such animals, and also donkeys, as here in our land, here at Bulawayo, I only know of one SPCA hospital, that is at Belmont, if I'm not mistaken. I wish, that SPCA hospitals can be prevalently found, at all places, as the owners, of pets, they are incapacitated, in of such, they are unable, to treat, the pets, and animals, how I wish, the sponsors, and the well wishers, they can contribute to that, to the building of such, such hospitals for these